All right. I will call to order the Finance Committee meeting of Monday, April 26, 2021, and ask Dave to call the roll, please.
Alder Abbas.
Present.
Alder Revere.
Here.
Alder Furman.
Present.
Alder Carter.
Present.
Alder Figueroa Cole.
Here.
Alder Curry is not in the meeting yet. Mayor,
Present.
you have quorum, Mayor.
Thank you. Can we start with staff reading the meeting instructions, please?
All right. Welcome to our virtual meeting. If you lose connection at any point during the meeting, you can reconnect by clicking the link or calling the number in your original email. Members of the committee, if you're able, please activate your video and keep it on for the duration of the meeting. Staff, if you're able, please activate your video when you're speaking. Please use the raise hand feature when you'd like to be recognized to speak, ask questions, or request a roll call vote. Staff, please use the raise hand feature when you're asked a question. In this meeting, panelists have the ability to mute and unmute themselves. The chair will do their best to call on committee members in the order in which hands are raised. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. Members of the public who have registered to speak, the name you entered in Zoom must match the name you entered in registration. You will remain muted until called upon. Staff will tell you when your time is up. After speaking, a member of the body may ask you a question. If you need to share documentation with the committee, please send it to the email listed on today's agenda. Mayor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We have no public comment, so we'll move past that. And to disclosures and recusals, I'll just say a word for new Finance Committee members. Disclosures and recusals are perhaps more important for the Finance Committee because all of the items we deal with money. So we will ask every meeting whether there are any disclosures or recusals necessary. A disclosure would be when you may have some perceived interest in an item, but you don't feel it impacts your vote. A recusal would be when you or your employer or an organization you're affiliated with stand to benefit from the item that's being voted on, in which case you would both notify us and then you would recuse yourself from participating in both the conversation and the vote. So that explained, are there any disclosures or recusals for today's meeting? Seeing none, we will move on to the consent agenda. Finance Committee, similar to the Council as a whole, uses a consent agenda model. So we ask members of the committee if there are items that you wish to discuss or ask questions on, to separate those from the consent agenda. At this point in time, we have items 14 and 15 separated because they are a presentation and a closed session respectively. We have no registrants, so there are no items that would be separated for public comment. Are there agenda items that any committee members wish to have removed from the consent agenda at this time? Alder Figueroa Cole.
So again, being new, I went ahead and studied all the items in the agenda. So if we are not going to discuss them individually, if we don't take them out of the consent agenda.
That's correct. If they remain on the consent agenda, we'll have one vote for all the items on the consent agenda. So if you have questions or wish to discuss particular items, now would be the time to tell us which ones, and we'll remove those from the consent agenda.
So I have been talking to staff on the background on regards to agenda items related to the Park Street area, the $3 million and the $12 million one, and the transfer of the funds from the Stoughton to Park Street. So I would like to just discuss that a little bit further.
Right, Alder, I need agenda items for those.
Sure, I'll get those. So the agenda items are 64795, which is item number 6 on the agenda.
Item number 6.
And actually, I think that is the main one. The other one is just a transfer from one side to the other, and it's just a negative coming in and then going into the second one. So I think that to me is the main one that I have more questions.
This is your chance to ask questions in a committee meeting, so don't feel discouraged from pulling items.
Okay. Yeah, I think, and then the one that agenda item number 13, 65116, just a very general question. That one I don't really. And I think the rest I found the answers to my questions.
Great. Thank you, Alder. Any other items that people wish to have separated from the consent agenda? Okay, so we have then items 6, 13, 14, and 15 separated. We'll also note that the recommended action on item number 11 is to refer to a future meeting. So that will be the motion in the consent agenda, unless there's any desire to separate that item to discuss that motion. Alder Verveer.
Thank you, Mayor. I would like an explanation of the need for referral on that item. Staff has not shared that with me previously.
Right, for number 11, then we'll separate that as well.
Thank you.
Are there any other items for separation? All right, so at this point in time, we have agenda items 6, 11, 13, 14, and 15 separated from the consent agenda. On the balance of the agenda will remain on the consent agenda. And for a motion, President Abbas.
Motion to approve consent agenda.
Alder Carter, would you second?
Second.
It's moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda. Is there any objection to recording a unanimous vote in favor? Seeing none, we'll record a unanimous vote in favor of those items, and we'll move to item number 6. So item number 6 is Legistar 64795, approving the amendment to the project plan for TID 42. Vice President Abbas, a motion?
Motion to approve.
Alder Carter?
Second.
Moved and seconded to approve. Alder Figueroa Cole, questions?
Yes. So I think I have most of the questions answered in regard how the funds are moving on this particular resolution. So I'm still a bit confused, so maybe you can just redirect me on to where to find details on the analysis that is done to determine how many parking slots this particular project is going to be covering. According to the information I found, most of the money of the $11,000 seeking to be approved are to build a parking structure and to fix existing parking areas. And my main concern when I first started looking into it is just trying to understand how these $11 million or this project aligns with the rest of the master plan. I know that we're focused on the transit changes, and we are focused on having a lower carbon footprint by 2030. So it kind of like puts into question why spend all this money on its parking structure when we're trying to make people use less vehicles. So how does that fit into the bigger plan? Really, this is my question. How do we meet both criteria, the 2030 criteria and making more space for cars to be parked?
Matt, just for the sake of the rest of us and anybody watching, would you just start with a brief overview of the project and then get into the questions about parking ratio, and perhaps site density as well?
Sure. So the Village on Park currently is it's mixed use in that it's a mix of retail, government services, and office use, and it's parked a little over 2 parking stalls per 1,000 square feet of rentable space, which is a very low parking ratio. We would typically see 3+ parking stalls for this kind of use. And so it's very common if you go to the Village on Park at noon on a Monday that the whole parking lot is full, because we've got people going to the clinic for an appointment, going to the library for an appointment, shopping at the grocery store. So the parking lot gets a lot of use, and it's our main constraint in sort of doing anything more intensely on the site. And the existing master plan, as well as the proposals that are coming through the South Madison plan, are really to use the site much more intensely and have it be really a commercial and community hub for South Madison. And so the project that's sort of in front of us is to work with the Urban League, who has their main office there right now. And what they want to do is create a business incubator project modeled on the Sherman Phoenix in Milwaukee that would bring together a bunch of smaller businesses, primarily owned and operated by people of color, and support them in that business hub, and then have more traditional office sort of uses above it. So it's about a 60,000 square foot building, and using our sort of standard parking ratios for that building, you would expect that building to generate a need for almost 200 parking spots on its own. And then the Community Development Authority has also expressed a desire to add affordable housing to the site as well. So we're looking at about a 60-ish unit apartment building to go on the northern end of that site. And so when you take the spot where you have to build that office building for Urban League, and then you take the spot where we're going to add affordable housing, you take away over 100 stalls to create buildings. And then you're also adding a bunch more intense uses, which is going to drive a need for parking. So that's why we're proposing to build the parking structure. Because by building a parking structure, we can turn a bunch of surface lots into development pads. The Village on Park has also had a number of stormwater issues over the years, resulting in a few years ago, the building actually flooded, and the city clerk lost a bunch of voting related equipment that was stored in our basement. We patched that problem, but we haven't solved some of the overall stormwater issues. And then when we get into it, we're going to be subject to the city's new stormwater ordinance. So we're going to have to do some significant green infrastructure on the site to manage stormwater, because the water can't physically flow off site too far because it runs into the belt line. So we need to deal with stormwater on the site itself. And so the structure budget line item also covers taking care of stormwater, taking care of just other site related issues in that number. So that's where we get the sort of the number that's the parking structure is to replace parking, make sure we have enough to make sure that what is there will work. But overall, Dan or Joe, correct me, we're still going to have a parking ratio overall for the site that is below market standards, because we know we're on a bus rapid transit line, and just physically you can only fit so much on there. That answers the general question.
So then the $9 million and $9.1 million that is associated to parking, I mean, that line is just really kind of implies that it's just parking. And I know the stormwater thing is mentioned, but it sounds like you have kind of an estimate on mind on how much that extra work is going to be. Is it fair to say that perhaps we could be a little more clear on breaking that up? what it goes to parking versus, to the parking structure versus all the other variances.
Sure. So I guess the one thing is there's going to be a number of resolutions related to this project. This first one just is the broad authority in the TIF district to spend on the project. Then there will be more specific, there's a slightly more specific budget amendment in front of you, and then there'll be even more detail in the budget for 2022. And then there'll be much finer detail once we do some of this initial engineering and design work, when we have the actual contracts to go and build it. And those will go through the CDA, but each step we go will be much more detailed into exactly how many parking stalls, exactly what's getting built, exactly how much is going for stormwater. But this is the first step in getting that engineering and design team on board to sort out all of those pieces. So right now, the numbers that we're working off of are planning's estimate of the number of parking stalls that would fit in a typical parking structure there, and our engineering department giving a broad estimate of total cost for this type of project. We don't have an architect or engineer on board yet. We have not done the fine line item costing yet because we're just not that far.
Okay. I mean, again, I'm sorry, guys. My first attempt at understanding what is happening with all these resolutions. And I totally get what you're saying, and I'll take it. And I understand there's more to come. And I also gather that it's subject to change. So at the end of the day, it might be you guys may be asking for even more money to complete this particular structure, or less money depending on what the details are. So I definitely would like to further discuss with you, maybe over the phone, so we can, so I can really get my bearings here. But when I see that, and when I see that breakup that was provided, it really is, I don't know. I guess it was a bit shocking to me to see the number being just focused on a structure, on a parking, on a parking structure, and then see one line for $200,000 in affordable housing labeled as affordable housing, like giving the impression that we are actually going to do something on that regard. And again, that is a big topic of mine, to make sure that those funds that are allocated for affordable housing, with all the understanding all the restrictions that are out there from the federal government on that regard. So just having all that combined together and all those both words together really throw some flags at me. That's really what I was coming from.
Yep, and I'll be honest, this is a complicated multi-part project that involves TIF, which is complicated on its own, and it moves through the Community Development Authority. So we've got a lot of different people and a lot of different pieces moving on their own timeline. You have some more insight.
So I will make it. I promise you, it will get easier if I can understand a little bit more about that. I might spend the weekend learning about TIF. I could live the rest of my life without knowing what that was, but now I'm forced to understand that. So understanding how that works, how we get the money back, how we are pretty much lending all this money, but we get it back on taxes. So I got my bearings down. I got the glossary going on one side, just trying to understand all these terms. But so the sooner we can talk about the weeds here, the better, and I won't be bothering you as much as I have done already. So thank you.
Thank you, Alder. It is true that parking is inordinately expensive to build, no question, and can result in some fairly shocking price tags. But please don't worry. We are definitely investing in affordable housing as well. I think, Matt, it will be helpful to maybe present on the entire project, even though the different approvals will move through in pieces, on making sure that we understand the entire project in the probably near future is probably a useful thing to do. Alder Abbas, questions for staff?
Thank you. Yes. So Matt, as you know, I echo all the Figura Cole. Hope I did not mispronounce your name. About sustainability and BRT and Southside Medicine. Prospect Point is there, and we had quite a bit of discussion around it. I'm also curious to know this 9.1 million. Would that be a sufficient amount of money to, let's say, if we decide through sustainability point of view, we want to create, instead of 4-story parking lot, we want to create 5 and remove the surface parking to have less environmental impact. So would that will be sufficient money? I'm just curious how you came across this $9.1 million number for 4-story.
I'll let Dan weigh in on some of the details how we got to that number. One of the first things that we have to do is we've hired a geotechnical consultant to tell us what's in that soil. Can we go down? What can it support? All of that to know what's kind of physically possible. So we've engaged that, but it'll be a while before we have that. But Dan Rolfs can tell you how we added up to get the numbers we have.
If I could defer to Joe just to start with, and I can hum along in the background if that's all right.
Joe, you're muted.
Sorry. Alder.
And actually, I'm sorry, before we go much farther, I should have done this from the start. If you could introduce yourselves.
Oh, yeah. I am for the new, well, some of you know me. I am Joe Gramacki. I'm the TIF coordinator for the city of Madison. I guess in answer to the question, Alder Abbas, is we looked at it based on what typically we see for above ground parking, and then added a per stall cost based on the density that was suggested by planning. Now, one of the things is that above ground structured parking can range anywhere from, say, 15,000 a stall up to as high as 25 or 30,000 a stall, and it depends on what you do with it. If you build, for instance, a building above it where you have to have load bearing capacity on the ramp, so it has to be more robust, then that'll drive it closer to the 35 or even 40,000 a stall. If it's just a standalone, it can range. If there's soil issues underneath, it's kind of swampy, let's say, that would again push the cost slightly up. Now, surface parking is very cheap. It's only about $1,200 to $1,500 a stall. So if you lose, 100 stalls, you're not losing a heck of a lot of. It's not a heck of a lot of savings for us. But to add 100 stalls to a project could range $2 to $3 million extra. So it's kind of a balancing act. When we get a set of numbers back, we're going to look at what we need in terms of density for all the uses there, what we need to replace, as well as how much TIF can support, because a TIF is, when I get a chance to do TIF 101, which Alder Abbas, you've been through it a couple times with us, and for Alder Figueroa Cole, you'll get a chance this year, very soon. We'll do a TIF 101, which we do for all new alders, where we can explain that TIF is not an inexhaustible resource. It's very finite. There's only so much TIF that can be supported in a TID. So if this costs more than that, then we have to pare it back to match the sources of funding. So there's going to be, I think, as Matt Wachter stated, there's going to be some push, pull, tug based on cost, based on density, and based on policies, that you point out, like, we want to do some sustainable stuff. Okay, well, how much can we afford? Or if we save, if we put down 150 less stalls, maybe we can put a green roof, that sort of thing. So there's going to be a lot of that. And that comes after the TIF district is created. We start to have those discussions. And again, as we've discussed before, Alder Abbas, this is part of it's only the first phase of a multi-phase financing process, which is going to start for the South Side. This is probably one of the biggest investments done in this city in 50 years, and especially in this part of town. And the South Madison has not received this kind of attention for a long time. So everybody's going to be involved as far as oversight and input and that sort of thing. And we certainly welcome your input, Alder Abbas, as far as the sustainable issues. As you know, we talked about linking with PACE and some other programs that are out there. So it's certainly on our radar. And that's kind of how we came to this conclusion based on what we've seen in the marketplace for cost and what planning has told us is what is probably feasible. Again, when we get those costs back and the estimates from the engineers, we'll know a little bit more and we'll bring it back to this group.
Dan?
If I could just jump in on one more thing that Joe touched on, and Mayor, you alluded to as well, is this is step one of a multi-year process and investment into the South Side. And Alder Figueroa Cole, you noted some of the other items that are in this proposed project plan amendment for TID 42. The point to keep in mind, and Joe will talk about this when he does TIF 101. I don't know if it's a few weeks from now or whatever, but what we'll, you'll learn more about this, and the process that we're looking at is this is one TIF district that is making sort of using quirks in the TIF law to invest into South Madison. One of the other things that's coming down the road is a new TIF district for this area. And this is sort of I think we called it phase 1A of a multi-phase process to do an awful lot more. It just happens that our first step into this is working with the Urban League to free up a pad on the site at the Villager, or excuse me, at the Villager Park, to allow them to build their Black Business Hub. And as part of that, we have to build a parking structure. But the other pieces, as you note, Alder, in the project plan are things like affordable housing and other components. So it looks like right now there's a small number in there about what that is. But as we move forward and expand that in South Madison and do more with that, you'll see that number grow. And I think you'll see the number and types of projects grow. I believe my colleague Dan Johns was here from the CDA. He's working on some pretty exciting stuff that I think will come back to this entity and that will go through the CDA as well. So this is only one piece of a much larger process. And sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm Dan Rolfs. I'm the Community Development Project Manager. I work very closely with Joe, and I work for Matt. I've worked for the city for going on 17 years now in the same capacity. I apologize for not letting you know that right away. The last point that I would raise is if you do have questions, you've got our names, please feel free to reach out. We can try to help address any of those questions now. But last thing, just to, for folks who are new, this is probably the most exciting thing that I think we've done with this program in an awful long time. So I hope that we'll be able to have support for it as it moves forward.
Thanks, Dan. Can I have one quick question for Matt, please?
Of course.
Matt, I understand the intent here is to, first we have to allocate money. There's a multi-phase project. I'm just from process standpoint, I'm just curious when we hire engineer or consultant to really look at the soil quality, either we have 4-story, 3-story, we still have to do, I believe, a study on how much parking spot we need, correct? And where that process will be done at CDA committees, or would it come to, could you please talk about the process? I know the final thing will come in front of council, but would it come to finance?
Sure. So normally everything's going to, in this case, because it's a CDA project, and the CDA has a separate set of processes and approvals where they approve things themselves. So we could probably make sure we do informational pieces to bring back, but at the end of the day, like the contracts will be signed by the CDA because they're their own separate body politic. But we can certainly make sure that we do informational and get feedback from broader group of things. I'll be honest. I mean, Joe and Dan can weigh in. We haven't done something exactly like this where we take TIF from all of the joint review board entities, move it through the city budget to hand it to the city to do a project, especially a complicated project. So we have to, there's a little bit of figuring out the exact process as we go for some of these things. Because usually CDA does its own thing. And so I don't have a great answer for you, but I can commit to making sure that we get more feedback rather than less on each step of the way.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Matt, I think President Abbas raises a good point. We know that this parking lot already acts as an informal park and ride, given its proximity to the transfer point. With BRT coming through this corridor, I would suspect that would just be more of an issue. And so it might be useful to talk sooner rather than later with Metro if you aren't already having those conversations.
Yep, we've started talking to Metro about future park and ride needs for South BRT, and I think from the initial conversation, this site isn't big enough for exactly configured to do what they would need it to do to function as a park and ride. We've also just this morning, Dan Rolfs and I met with Madison College to talk about their parking needs and whether some of their people might need intermediate term solution parking here as they figure out their parking scenario. So we're working with all of those partners to try to manage it. And I think the other complicating factor here is right now we have a large surface lot that is free parking. And so we enforce it, but that's what's there today. And we're moving to structured parking that's going to have some charge affiliated with it. And we're also going to have to separate how do we treat people who are coming in to get, to grab a donut at Lane's versus someone who's parking all day because they're working in the office, and they have very different parking needs, and we're going to have to manage that. So we'll also have consultants and, the operator and the Urban League. We're going to have to figure this out together, exactly how to separate out all of those parking needs and get the right solution for them.
Thank you. Alder Figueroa Cole. You're muted.
Okay, thank you for all the details on the project, and I agree. I mean, process is super important. Echoing President Abbas' comments. So to understand the processes within this group, it will be extremely relevant, and then to be able to translate that to our constituents, because I think we all acknowledge that that area needs some attention, and it should get it, but it will make it easier to all of us in the long run if we have that vision already on paper, the larger vision, so we can present that not only to us, but in the city council, take a minute to present that to the rest of the council members and the public, so that you won't get as much pushback as you'll probably get when someone sees $11 million built on a parking structure. Because that's all what their line says. They don't have all the level of detail that you provided here. So I really encourage for us to work together to get that vision down in a way that can translate to the rest of the public. So thank you. And Jael made it.
Thank you, Alder. Welcome, Alder Curry. Glad to see you. We are on item number 6, questions for staff. I believe we have now exhausted questions for staff on item number 6. It has been moved and seconded to adopt. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of item number 6? Seeing no objection, we'll record that and go on to item number 11. Alder Curry, we use a consent agenda at Finance Committee also. So the items that were pulled from the consent agenda were 6, which we just disposed of, 11, 13, 14, and 15. So moving on to item number 11, which is Legistar 64637, a substitute amending the capital budget to transfer borrowing authority between major program for wayfinding and major program for Monona Terrace, John Nolan Drive, and authorizing entrance into a contract for purchase of services. Can I get a motion, President Abbas, to refer to a future meeting?
Yep. Motion to refer to future committee meeting, finance committee meeting.
Alder Carter, a second.
Second.
Thank you. Alder Verveer, questions for staff?
Thank you, Mayor. As my colleagues might have noted, I am a co-sponsor of this resolution, and I had not heard until your announcement at the top of this meeting, Mayor, that there was a need for a re-referral. So I would like an explanation of where that came from, please.
Mayor, I can try to answer that question. I don't think there's anybody from engineering on the call. We were contacted by engineering on Friday afternoon that this item was not ready and that they wanted it referred to a future meeting. They referred to issues of scope of the contract and funding level. So that's what we know. This was a last minute request from engineering.
Thank you, Dave. Was that from Graham or Yang? So I can reach out to, could you actually forward me the email, please? And I'll have a personal conversation with either Graham or Yang, wherever that came from.
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Alder. Any further questions or any discussion? Seeing none, the motion is to refer. Is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of referral? Seeing none, that item is referred. That will bring us to agenda item number 13, which is Legistar 65116, amending public health's operating budget to accept funds from FEMA to support vaccination efforts. President Abbas.
Motion to accept.
Alder Carter.
Second.
And Alder Figueroa Cole, questions?
Yes, can you guys explain to me that transfer? Is that coming directly from FEMA, the money, or do we have a local FEMA bucket that would take the money that was there already and move it into the health system? That's really my question. How does those two buckets work?
Janelle, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Janelle Heinrich, Director of Public Health, Madison, Dane County. We had a chance to present to you on all good things public health a couple weeks ago. So I will ask Kate Austin, our Director of Operations, to jump in on your question, Alder.
Good evening, all. Kate Austin, Director of Operations. So this funding, it was an application. We worked closely with Dane County Emergency Management to submit this expedited request for public assistance funding. The way the money will flow is from FEMA to Wisconsin Emergency Management, which then flows down to Dane County Emergency Management and then to Public Health Madison, Dane County. And this money is for reimbursement for our expenses related to COVID administration, both the mass vaccination site at the Alliant Energy Center, as well as our smaller mobile sites throughout the city and the county.
So then we're just changing the budget to include the money from those fundings. That's all we are doing, just taking money in so you can get reimbursed.
Exactly. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Alder. It occurs to me, Dave, that it might also be useful for you to just briefly outline why we need to amend the budget to accept funds like this.
Certainly, Mayor. So any change to the budget that changes an appropriation, meaning monies that are authorized by the council to be expended, regardless of funding source, requires an amendment to that adopted budget. And so these funds were not included in the adopted 2021 budget. Public Health is now aware of these federal dollars available. And so the budget needs to be amended to reflect the additional appropriation, effectively the additional expenditure authority associated with these federal dollars.
So in the case of the TIF transactions that we seen earlier, there was a couple amendments, resolutions. One to have the negative pulling the money from the Stoughton source, and then another one to put the money into the Windgrass source. In this case, you have the in and the out in one resolution. You are not required to separate them, or is that? Why is it? What is the process different for that?
Right. So it was before you on that item related to the Wingard TIF was a change to the project plan, and that is not a part of the budget. You will see that in future resolutions, and I think as Matt Wachter said, in the 2022 capital budget, in terms of the actual expenditure, authority to spend those dollars for that project. So at this point, what's before you or what you saw and acted on was an amendment to the project plan.
Okay, thank you. So you can make a funding, like a transfer like these multiple transfers within one resolution, as long as you follow the money. This money is coming, like she explained, from FEMA to the state, county, all the way down, and then you moving it into their budget for expenses. You can do all that in one.
So from
Yep.
the city point of view, you generally would see the money is coming in from whatever source, and then we are spending it this way.
Yeah.
Those would both be in one resolution. Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Perfect. Thanks.
So you're approving the grant to receive the monies, and then you have to amend the budget to allow the appropriation of the monies from effectively the Treasury. And that appropriation is an amendment to the budget, requires an amendment to the budget.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alder. Thank you, Dave. Any other questions? The motion is to adopt. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of item 13? Seeing no objection, that vote is recorded. And that will bring us to item 14, Legistar 65169, which is a presentation on the capital budget process. Dave, do you want to maybe start by sharing the good news?
What good news was that?
That in the future, it will not be you having to give all these presentations?
Oh, yeah. Well, I did send out an email. I'm sure I'll still be giving some of them, but yes, we do have a new budget manager. That position's been vacant for about 6 months. The new budget manager's name is Christine Coe, and she comes to us from the city of Somerville, Massachusetts. And she will be starting full-time on May 24th. And I know you'll all join me in welcoming Christine to the city. And I think there is a finance committee meeting on May 24th. So she will be at that meeting, and you'll get to see her. And we'll definitely see her in a number of contexts over these next few months as we are in the midst of the budget process again. So thank you, Mayor. All right, I will share my screen. Can everyone see that? All right. So we thought it would be good, and we will continue to do this throughout the budget process to update you where we are at on the 2022 capital budget and capital improvement plan. And recently, the mayor provided her instructions to agencies for the capital budget, and we will run through that process and some background over these next few slides. So just to remind you of that distinction between capital and operating, you'll obviously see both But the first step in the process is developing the capital budget, which is focused on physical infrastructure. They span multiple years. For example, the city recently renovated the Madison Municipal Building, and a $30 million project. And so that was a multi-year project. The capital budget is funded primarily by the sale of debt, both what we call promissory notes and bonds. And then that debt is paid back by debt service that you see in the operating budget. And we have a planning process that's focused on the upcoming year. That's called the capital budget. And then the capital improvement plan is the following 5 years. Now, in contrast, the operating budget, that's the focus on the daily operations of the city and paying for those on an ongoing basis, and supports the staff and supplies for all the city's programs and services. It's funded by property tax primarily, as well as fees and fines and state and federal grants, which we just talked about in the last agenda item as one example. And that process is focused. It's an annual budget process, and we also look at longer range projections to look at in terms of structural sufficiency in the budget. Just a reminder on the city's bond rating. So we've had the highest rating possible, which is often called AAA since the 1970s. And having a AAA rating means the lowest possible cost of borrowing on our general obligation debt. Now, just to highlight a little for you a little bit further, that is our general obligation debt. We also have revenue bond debt for our water utility and sewer utility. They are rated differently and rated lower because that revenue stream is not sort of a pledging of the full faith and credit of the city like the general obligation debt is. And so our rating on general obligation debt is based on these 4 measures. I won't go into them in a lot of detail, but it really is about the strength of our tax base and stability of that tax base, a sufficient fund balance. So we have a target of 15% of our subsequent year budget having in reserves and a fund balance. But most AAA issuers have a much larger fund balance. And so it's important that we maintain that fund balance. I've highlighted 2 areas that come to fore in developing the capital budget, namely that we have manageable debt levels. Our debt levels have been increasing over the last few years on a per capita basis, but we do pay our debt off rapidly. We pay it off in 10 years for the most part, whereas most governments are issuing 20-year debt and are carrying that debt longer. Another factor, and again, it's a positive in Madison's case, is that we have strong governing policies and we adhere to those policies. All right, turning to building the budget. It actually started a few months ago at the beginning of the year where we're identifying what ongoing costs we need, looking at priorities. We're now in the phase of the mayor's issued instructions, and agencies are developing their capital budget requests right now. We will be back in front of you on May 24th to update you on where the operating budget stands for 2022. And that will be the same day that agencies receive their instructions on the operating budget from the mayor. Once the agencies complete their requests, we move into the executive budget phase, which takes the whole entire summer to do both the capital and operating budget. And then in the fall, it moves to the Finance Committee and Council for their review and amendments of the executive capital and operating budgets, and the budget is ultimately adopted in November. So just a quick reminder of the budget that's was adopted back in November and is in place now for 2021, almost $900 million. The great majority of that is in the operating budget. This is an all funds budget, so it's not just the general fund, it's all the utilities and other funding sources. The operating budget funds about 106 services across the 37 city agencies. The capital budget, about 20% of that total, funds about 127 capital projects and programs. Now, those are new projects. We also have funding that we carry over from year to year that's approved by the council for projects that were approved in prior years in the capital budget. Just again, a quick reminder, almost half of the budget is for public works activities, and most of that is in the engineering area. So repaving of streets, reconstructing streets, all the infrastructure under the streets, the water utility, sewer, stormwater, and so on. Followed by transportation, the bulk of which there is going to be metro transit and its both its facilities and equipment purchases. I guess the utilities are broken out. That's the water and sewer and stormwater utilities. Planning and development, most of that is going to be a combination of affordable housing as well as TIF projects. You can see parks highlighted there, public safety and health. That'll be public health, fire, and police departments, and then sort of the rest of the budget. So a key measure that we look at is what's happening with debt service. So we issue the debt. We create the capital budget, and I said earlier, we fund most of that budget from debt, and we pay that back in what's called debt service, and that is an item in the operating budget, and it does represent the third highest amount or share of the city's general library fund budget. That debt service on general obligation debt only. That debt service is a little under $100 million this year. That was up a couple $1 million from the prior budget. And then our general obligation debt at the end of 2020 was about $535 million. And there is an overall limit in the state constitution of what we're allowed to issue as debt. And it's 5% of our overall property value in the city. And we're at about 1/3 of that limit. You'll look around the state, and some communities and their budgets are at that limit or slightly below it. So we're in good shape there. And that, again, shows the strength of Madison's economy. This line graph here shows the trend of that debt service share of the general fund budget and where it's projected to go based on the capital improvement plan that was adopted in for 2021. And so it's about 17% of the general fund and library fund budget. All funds, it's about 24%. And that just reflects that, particularly in the utilities, the sewer and water utilities, a large share of their budget is really capital oriented and related to the debt service to pay that back is a larger share of their revenues. So running quickly again through the capital improvement planning process, just a quick overview. We are in this process that I highlighted there, the agency request process. They received their instructions a few weeks ago. They are now looking at their priorities relative to the mayor's priorities and are developing proposals for the mayor's consideration in the executive budget. Then we move into the executive budget phase, where all of those requests are analyzed, evaluated, compared to priorities. The finance department will make recommendations as what should be in the SIP and the capital budget. And then there's also a management review team that will also provide some feedback to the mayor. And then that budget will be finalized, documents prepared, and that will be then introduced to the council on the very last day of August. Usually it's early September, but the calendar works out the end of August. And then it moves into the legislative review phase where it goes to the finance committee. The finance committee will hold public hearings. It will then also hear from the agencies about what's in the executive capital budget. And then the finance committee and the full council through that process will be able to amend the capital budget. And then it will again return to the full council in November along with the operating budget, where it can also be amended at that point and then ultimately adopted. So here's the calendar. That kickoff was, as I said, about 2 weeks ago. Those budgets requests from the agencies are due May 25th. And June will be spent evaluating agency requests. The agencies will meet with the mayor to talk about their capital budget requests, and it'll be reviewed by the management review team. Finance will make its recommendations to the mayor at the end of June, with final decisions occurring at the end of July. So keep in mind the operating budget is also going on at the same time, so we have to coordinate those two. And then that month of August is really spent pulling together all of the transmittal and communication materials around the executive budget. You'll see that second week of September for Finance Committee hearings, amendments the third week of September, and the Finance Committee will take its action on the executive capital budget at the end of September. And then budget adoption occurs that second week of November. So the management review team for the capital budget includes the Public Works team leader, who in this case is the city engineer, the transportation director, the planning, community, and economic development director, the IT director, and then added this year is the equity manager and the sustainability staff, as well as the finance director. And then we will be giving the council regular updates through the finance committee, as you're seeing today, on both the operating and capital budget. And this will be the opportunity for both you as members of the finance committee and the full council to hear about the process, get the background and where we're at with the status of the budget. So I'll walk through quickly what the mayor delivered in terms of her instructions to the agencies on the executive capital budget. So again, the priorities of climate resiliency, equity, financial sustainability, housing affordability, and transit access. All agencies are encouraged to try to find ways to decrease spending in the 2022 capital budget. They are urged to prioritize every single one of their projects and programs, their proposals, and they should discuss the criteria used. And then requests to change existing projects should really be consistent with what's in the adopted budget, and that any sort of deviations from that should be clearly explained. So new projects, so that would be, for example, for discrete facilities, new equipment, things like that. They can be submitted, but they have to be a complete proposal. They have to have all the information needed in terms of cost, operating impacts, timeline, design approach, and things like that. We also have a process that we instituted a few years ago called the Horizon List. So these might be projects that aren't yet fully defined, but we want to get them into at least a review process. And there might be issues yet to address. It's not a fully defined project or program yet. And agencies will be able to propose adding new projects to that list, as well as those projects being ultimately added in the executive budget by the mayor. And then program budgets. So these are things for ongoing activities that happen every year, such as pavement management or playground improvements. Agencies can increase those budgets in the last year of the SIP by up to 5% over the prior year, again, to account for inflation. So some of the key elements, project and program prioritization, and that prioritization will be a key element of the process. As many of you or most of you know, the council adopted a new ordinance related to surveillance technology. And in it, there are a number of pieces of information that need to be included in budget requests for those items that are deemed to be surveillance oriented. On the racial equity and social justice perspective, new questions have been added that agencies need to answer as part of every proposal that they make in the capital and ultimately in the operating budget as well. And then again, as you know, the American Rescue Plan Act and other federal funding, it's a dynamic process right now. Some agencies will know and have a sense of how to incorporate that into their capital budget requests. Others, those things might be added in the executive budget or later in the process. So just quickly, the components of the agency budget request. The transmittal memo is the place where the priorities are laid out very clearly. Then there's the discrete proposals made by the agencies, so requests for capital funding, how the funds will be spent, and what they're trying to accomplish. That's also the place where the equity, racial equity, and social justice questions will be answered. And then the surveillance form will also have to be filled out. That's developed by information technology to conform to the ordinance on surveillance technology. So these are the components of the transmittal memo. It also includes not only a prioritization list, but areas where proposals or requests can be scaled up, down, primarily, or phased in over time to provide options. And then any describing any impacts of COVID-19 in terms of timetables for capital projects. On the racial equity and social justice perspective, this is a new section added this year in consultation with the city's racial equity and social justice tools and training team. And that team will be providing some training. Christy Kumar, the city's new equity division administrator, Tarek will also be providing training to agencies to help answer these questions. And you can just see them up on the screen here in terms of how, the agency described how they interacted with BIPOC people living in lower incomes or who are otherwise marginalized in terms of budget proposals. What other city agencies or community partners or others, how have they been engaged on this? Have we asked for perspectives? How will we continue to communicate with these groups throughout the process? What sort of data was used? And then what is this budget request the result of input from other city teams, such as the NRT teams, and MAC and WIC and so on in terms of developing this. And all that information will be available to the Finance Committee and the Council. It'll be included in agency budget requests and in the executive budget as well. Secondly, in that surveillance technology area, this just gives you the definitions of what surveillance technology is and what it's not, and the data that's collected and what that means, again, to inform the agencies about how they need to fill out the required form to provide that information to the mayor and council as these proposals are being considered. All right, so that's a quick run through of the 2022 capital budget process as it stands right now. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be back in front of you at various points throughout the next few weeks and months as this process unfolds, updating you on both where things stand with the capital budget. And then, as I said, on May 24th, we'll talk to you about the operating budget outlook and the instructions and message that the mayor gave to the agencies in terms of developing their operating budget requests.
Thank you, Dave. Are there questions for Dave on the capital budget process? Alder Figueroa Cole.
Thanks, Dave. I just have a few simple questions, I think. So the general fund and the library fund, are they separate funds or are they the same fund?
Those are two separate funds.
But I thought,
we consider them together because most of the funding in the library fund comes from the property tax. Okay, so for like state levy limit calculations and the state's expenditure restraint program, we have to consider those together. Okay, and then so the third highest item on that line are the, if I understood correctly, are the interest and repayments of the gold borrowing? Yeah, so the general obligation debt, so that's both principal and interest. So we're paying back that debt each year, and yes, it's the third largest part, single largest part of the budget. And I didn't see on the presentation how much was, is that a percentage or how much money are we talking about? You said that we pay in the debt in 10 years, which is at a faster rate than other areas. So I imagine that's quite a number that then takes away from other services.
Is that how that works?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the overall debt service on general obligation debt is about $98 million. About 57 million of that is paid from the general and library funds. So about a little more than half of that. Under the state levy limits, debt service on general obligation debt is excluded from the limits, meaning the city can levy for what it needs to pay its debt service. Now, the extent to which debt service gets higher and higher and the overall tax burden increases as a result, that's probably ultimately the constraint. That's why we try to show that impact of debt service as what's the trend in terms of its share of the overall general library fund budget.
And then the last question. So you mentioned that we try, not by policy, but by, by rule or whatever, we try to stay at the 15% rate. But currently, based on the information provided, we are at 16 or 17. Is that an anomaly because of COVID? Is it because of last year, or
I'm sorry, the 15%, you were talking about the general fund balance? I just want to be sure I'm answering the right question.
Yes, I think so. There was a graph in there that showed.
So that's a policy we include in every budget. That's the amount basically that we have in reserve as a share of the overall budget. And yes, it's I think we're mixing two things, but I'll finish my explanation of the general fund budget. We try to keep that at 15% or higher. And that's a part of our meeting our underlying requirements to maintain our AAA bond rating. And it's just good. It's best practice in terms of finances. I think the graph you were referring to, now that I'm talking about this, is the general fund debt service share of the general fund budget. So that, again, we're trying to show the trend there. It's at about 17%. Based on what's in the capital improvement plan, it'll peak out around 18%. There is no sort of strict policy around that. We had, prior to 2012, tried to keep it below 12.5%, but we've had, when you look at the rate of degradation of infrastructure in the city, we had a lot of infrastructure built in the 1960s and 70s, and that had to be rebuilt now. A good example of that is the Central Library downtown, built in 1965 and renovated at a cost of $30 million in 2012, 2013. A good example of the infrastructure. We have that in roads and streets and so on that needs to be done. So we try to keep that at least at a reasonable level of the budget, a manageable level of the budget, and try to avoid it, going up very rapidly.
And thank you. Those are all the questions I had on that regard. And it just occurred to me that I don't need answers here, but I would like to sit with someone to understand better the annexation of the town of Madison, so I can understand that also.
So we do plan to have a briefing on the town of Madison attachment, including the elements of that and the budget ramifications of it at the May 24th Finance Committee meeting. And so Heather Stouter and some of her team will be there, as well as we'll talk about the financial ramifications.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's all I got.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Verveer.
Thank you, Mayor. First, thank you, Dave, so much for the presentation. It's especially helpful to see the modifications to the process this year that are being implemented. Let me also thank you for anticipating one of my questions a few hours ago in your email with the good news about the new budget manager being hired. That was one of the questions that I planned to ask you about, is where we were with that process. And then just lastly, speaking of budget manager, in prior years, Laura Larson provided all alders the budget kickoff materials, the mayor's message, agency guidance, the PowerPoint, and so forth. I realize that much of that material was summarized, obviously, by your presentation tonight. But if you could, at your convenience, forward to all alders the capital budget kickoff material, I would appreciate that.
Yep, we'll do that, Alder Revere. What we'll probably do is put it up on the website so you can see it, and then send you a link to that.
Thank you. Yes, I checked your website to see if it was there yet, and
yeah, we're not on that yet, but we'll get there.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Dave. That's all I had. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Alder. President Abbas, I'll get used to it. Give me at least a meeting.
No worries. Thank you very much. Dave, thank you very much for the presentation explaining the process. I have one quick question about racial equity, and you mentioned about NRT. I'm just curious, what outreach plan do we have to reach out to disconnected communities and really make sure their voices get heard in the process?
So the NRTs have been in previous budgets engage with the agencies so that proposals can be sort of both brought forward through the agency request process as well as through the executive budget process, and we'll continue that as well. And the point of putting the questions in this budget is not just simply for them to answer questions, right? It's for them, it's really to get agencies focused on what you're talking about. What sort of outreach do they need to do and follow through with? And as I said, Christy Kumar and Tarek will be having continuous outreach to the agencies about how best to go about that and any questions that they might have in those outreach efforts.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Alder. I did also just want to note that I think I have talked to all of you, but I am making a concerted effort to talk to the entire council about capital budget items that you are particularly interested in. And so I think we still have a few alders that we're scheduling or I haven't met with yet. But I'm trying to make sure that I have a list from folks about items that you're particularly interested in, and so that we can take that into account earlier in the process than when it gets to finance for amendments. So certainly feel free to let me, deputy mayors or staff know if other items come up along the way. Any additional questions or discussion on item 14? Seeing none, we will move on to item 15, for which we need to go into closed session. So President Abbas, a motion to take us into closed session, please.
Motion for the closed session.
And you need to read the notice.
No, okay, just 1 second. Let me pull out. Too many windows are open right now. Just 1 second. I lost my agenda. Here we go. So, motion for bringing bargaining briefing for the finance committee in a closed session. That's correct.
Yes, and then the notice when the finance committee considers the following matter needs to be read. I can do it if you don't have it in front of you.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Right. So when the Finance Committee considers the following matter, it may go into closed session pursuant to section 19.85 sub 1 sub E of the Wisconsin statutes, which reads as follows: deliberating or negotiating the purchase of public properties, the investing of public funds, or conducting other specified public business whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require a closed session. If the Finance Committee does go into closed session, notice is hereby given pursuant to section 19.85 sub 2 of the Wisconsin statutes that it may reconvene in open session without waiting 12 hours as specified in the statute. So President Abbas will move to take us into closed session. Alder Carter?
Second.
Been moved and seconded to go into closed session. We do require a roll call vote to move into closed session. So Dave, would you please call the roll? All those in favor of going into closed session, aye. Those opposed, no, as Dave calls your name.
Alder Abbas,
Aye.
Alder Revere,
Aye.
Alder Furman,
Aye.
Alder Carter,
Aye.
Alder Figueroa Cole,
Aye.
Alder Curry,
Aye.
Mayor.
Aye.
It's unanimous, Mayor.
Thank you. So we will move into closed session. I'll ask staff that are not here for item 15 to leave. Just a reminder that any alders are welcome to stay, that even if you're not on Finance Committee. And it looks like we are on the way with the text. We're coming out of closed session on item number 15. Report out of closed session is that the Finance Committee received a briefing on collective bargaining on several fronts and had its questions answered. And that is the last item on our agenda. So President Abbas, unless there's any other business, a motion to adjourn would be in order.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's moved and seconded to adjourn. Is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of adjournment? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much. Have a good rest of your evening.